for the delay, but you know, it's nice to have a chance to chat. How was your break? All that. I want to thank the English department for helping make possible the lecture by Richard Deming, which I'll introduce. I'm Logan Esfield, I teach in the English department. And you, if not all of you. And Richard's going to talk about Black Mountain and Jonathan Williams and his photography. And I want to give just a brief introduction, very, very brief, to give you a sense of who he is, where he's coming from. He's both a poet and a critic, and he's recently published a book of poems called Let's Not Call It Consequence, which has recently won an award for a best first book by a young American poet. And also last year came out a book called Listening on All Sides Towards an Emersonian Ethics of Reading, where he talks about something you guys are fairly familiar with, most of you, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and his theories and philosophies of poetry and American life and culture, and reading through a history of American poetry. He has two sides, and he wears them very comfortably, the poet side and the critic side. And I wanted to share, by way of introduction, a couple of his definitions that give some insight into how he approaches whatever he's reading, whether it's a photographer, whether it's a poet, whether it's a philosopher. He talks in his book, Listening on All Sides, about what a philosopher is and what an artist is. And he gives little definitions for each of them, and I think both of them apply to him very, very nicely. So a philosopher, and sometimes he identifies as more of a philosopher than a poet or a critic. A philosopher, he says, is someone who analyzes systems of thought at a conceptual level, right? Analyzes systems of thought at a conceptual level, thinking abstractly, right? Thinking at the conceptual level. That's a philosopher asking these questions. An artist, he says, analyzes systems of thought at the experiential level, right? So both are analyzing things. An artist analyzes things, but in a different way. An artist analyzes things at the experiential level. I'm kissing using my hand now to experience, sort of something tangible, something reaching out to you, the experiential level. And I think, in part, we get, language is the great vehicle because it is both philosophical and artistic. It can both ask conceptual questions, abstract questions, and it can have those questions asked of itself, the experience of language, which poets provide, right, with words. So that when you're reading an artistic philosopher, as Richard Deming is, you're both being asked to think about a lot of questions at the conceptual or abstract level, and you're also aware of the fact that everywhere he goes with his thinking happens through the experience of language, and the questions that he's asking of language, and the questions that language is asking of him as well. So, without any more, I really want to give a warm welcome to Richard Deming, here from Yale University, where he's a teacher in the English department, way out east, on the East Coast, Atlantic, New Haven, Connecticut. So, please say hello.
Thanks, Logan. I wanted to say thanks to Logan in the English department and Anna Leahy for bringing us again. The name of the talk that I had originally presented was called Everyday Domain, which is part of the new book project that I'm working on. But as this is tied to Logan's class, I actually thought that I wanted to change things a little bit, and rather than sort of throw you into the abstract depths, can you have abstract depths, of my thinking, thank you for laughing, I wanted to actually kind of come at it almost from the ground up in terms of how I think. One of the things that I'm invested in and work on is contact points between different ways of thinking. In the first book, it was poetics, which was a kind of contact point of philosophy or theory and poetry. And in my new work in the last couple of years, what I've been doing a lot is also looking at visual culture and art specifically, and a lot of times it's photography or film. And so one of the figures that this brings me to is this kind of exemplar, which is Jonathan Williams. And I'm going to quickly go through the slides I have, and then I've prepared a talk. But I wanted to give you kind of a preview so you know what it is that you're getting into, what I'm getting into, in that you may not be familiar with Jonathan and his work, even though he's really kind of an important background figure in terms of post-war American poetry. And he's best known as a publisher and as a poet. But the case I'm making is that really one of his, in some ways, I think his most important contribution is as a photographer, even though he tends to play that down. So in the talk, that when I get to the official part of it, I'll talk about Black Mountain, which is where Jonathan studied, Black Mountain College, which I'm not sure, I'll just kind of talk as if you're not familiar with it. Black Mountain College was started in 1933, and it closed down in 1956, 57. And it was really, if you're interested in American art of the 20th century and American literature of the 20th century, particularly American poetry, you've probably heard of Black Mountain, or if not yet, you're about to. There was nothing like Black Mountain before, and there's never really been anything since. What it was the school in North Carolina, and this is a sign not far from the Black Mountain area, and it was really in this rural area on the lake, on Lake Eden, in Black Mountain. It's near Asheville, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. And what happens is they put together this really radical school that was kind of a little bit like an educational commune, in that it was run completely by the faculty. There weren't deans, there weren't presidents, there was one person more or less who would be kind of an administrator, called the rector, but otherwise there wasn't like all of the kind of apparatus that we have at most of our schools. And they also ran a farm that was on the property, and faculty and students would both work the farm. And you'd see professors go out and milk the cows and dig the ditches, or dig the dishes. I don't know. They were doing all this work together, as well as going back and then creating all of this work. And the arts were a really important part of the thinking of Black Mountain. And what they wanted to do was create this space where people didn't come and learn and sit and take notes. That you would come and Logan was talking about experiential experiences. What they were interested in was creating experiential learning, in which you would not be told all the technical stuff. You would basically be thrown into making things and doing things. And some of the most important artists, certainly the most important artists of America, works in some way connected to that. Joseph Albers, who came from Germany, left Europe because of the coming war, he was an important figure of the Bauhaus, and he came, and he was an important teacher at Black Mountain. And some of the students included people like Cy Twombly, Merce Cunningham, the famous dancer, taught there for a while. John Cage, probably the most important avant-garde composer ever, taught there as well. Charles Olson, a famous poet, wrote the Maximus poems, taught there. I mean, everybody was really there at some time. And so I don't know how well you know some of the names that I'm going to mention, but this is one example, I think, that best exemplifies the thinking of Black Mountain. This is by Robert Rauschenberg, who died just last year, and certainly one of our most important artists. And if you see what Rauschenberg has done, and he did this, he started on this piece in 55, finishes in 59, which is just after he was a student at Black Mountain, the very late 40s, and then kind of became a teacher. And at Black Mountain, a lot of times, if you start doing the work there, there's a fuzzy line between who was a student and who was a teacher, because a lot of times the students would just start teaching classes. It was a college that was never accredited. And in fact, very few people actually graduated, because when you would come after about 2 years, you were supposed to propose a project. And very few, because the standards were so high, very few of the artists or writers that came through Black Mountain ever felt that they were ready to do their project and submit it to the people. So very few people actually technically graduated from Black Mountain in its time. But anyway, so this is Rauschenberg. And if you see what happens is that you have the surface here, which is a bit like a painting, and he collages all this material in there. But this is what he would call a combine. And so it combines principles of sculpture with the Angora goat, which is a real sort of stuffed Angora goat, with an inner tube, and he paints the face on it, and he puts this on top of this panel, this painted panel. So what we have here is a sort of conflation of all these different kinds of art, painting, collage, and sculpture, and it creates this radical new possibility of what art can be in the 50s, using found objects, because one of the things that they wanted to do was collapse the distance between art. They didn't want to see art as this high culture completely removed from the everyday. They wanted to close the gap between an artistic life and everyday life. So you were an artist in everything you said or did. Everything you said or did was somehow breathing your art. And so this is what Rauschenberg, in a sense, does. And it breaks all the boundaries. Is this a painting? Is it sculpture? What is it? And this is the sort of thing that happened in Black Mountain. And Jonathan Williams, I think, really is one of the great exemplars of that. So then I'll just start reading from my talk and kind of start going through some of the images that I have here. And this one is of Robert Creeley, who was a teacher, actually, of Logan and mine at Buffalo, and is probably the most famous of the Black Mountain writers. It might be helpful to know that Black Mountain is famous for its artists basically through the 40s, 30s and 40s, and then in 1950 or so, Charles Olson shows up, the famous poet, wrote the Maximus poems, wrote a famous book about Melville called Call Me Ishmael. And in the 50s, the literary side of Black Mountain is really why it becomes important, and the Black Mountain poets are connected to Black Mountain College. So the name of the talk is Portraying the Contemporary. While he will be remembered as a Black Mountain poet and the publisher of the Jargon Society, Jonathan Williams initially went to Black Mountain College, that kiln of avant-garde aesthetics, in 1951 to study photography with Aaron Siskin and Harry Callahan, artists whom Williams had first met earlier that year in Chicago at the Institute of Design. And I want to give you some images. This is a Harry Callahan image, as is this. This is one of probably Callahan's most famous. That's his wife, Eleanor, I believe. And these are by Aaron Siskin. So these are the two teachers that, and this is a photograph that I'll be talking about of Siskin by Jonathan. So I just wanted to give you an idea of who I'm talking about. Williams had already left Princeton at that time, convinced the school was too stultifying and conservative, given the range of Williams's abilities and creative intellect, that he would find traditional university study too confining, too overdetermined, and overdetermining is not at all surprising. In the 1950s, Black Mountain College, which offered a central site of community for figures from Merce Cunningham to Buckminster Fuller to the composer Stefan Volpe, seemed to be the only place able to accommodate the explosion of possibilities for imagining artistic production that were forming at that moment for the broadening field of the American avant-garde. When Williams arrived, the poet Charles Olson was the school's chief administrator, as loose a role as can be imagined, and Olson made clear in all levels of pedagogy that the self was any artist's true instrument. And I'm going to quote from Olson, "I take it wisdom, like style, is the man. That is not extricable in any sort of statement of itself," writes Olson in the essay Against Wisdom as Such. "But truths are," he insists, "in no wise or at the gravest loss verbally separated. They stay the man, as his skin is, as his life, and to be parted with only as that is." For those of Black Mountain, the art in any and all forms was inseparable from the person and from one's way of being in the world. Interestingly, but perhaps also frustratingly, certain of Williams's roles get more attention than others. Along with the school's other famous alumni, Jonathan Williams was one of the quintessential hyphenated cultural workers of the last 50 years. As the publisher of Jargon, Williams directly changed the face of post-war American poetry. Not only did he launch or sustain the careers of Russell Edson, Robert Creeley, Louis Zukowsky, Mina Loy, but he logged thousands of hours and miles distributing the work across the United States and Europe, placing books in people's hands. I mean, they would just throw the books in his car. He would publish these books, drive them to readings, to bookstores, and put them in people's hands. Right? Measured against Williams's Herculean efforts, today's bloggers have it easy. As a poet himself, Williams was a bit of a coterie author, though never quite as neglected as he made out to be, given the friends, fans, and well-wishers who would make pilgrimages to North Carolina to pay homage to him. Williams counted Hugh Kenner, Russell Banks, David Hockney, amongst others, as part of a company of interlocutors and supporters. However, the role of Williams that seems to get the least attention is his role as photographer. Williams's talent was for the portrait photograph, and he took hundreds of these over 5 decades, primarily of authors, artists, and musicians who lived and worked outside of the mainstream. Figures such as the poet Basil Bunting, the outsider artist Howard Finster, and the master of Southern Gothic photography, Ralph Eugene Meatyard. Despite 2 published collections of portraits, A Palpable Elysium and Portrait Photographs, Williams's abilities as a photographer remain undervalued. Engaging Williams's photography reveals insights into his work as a whole, as well as indicates the various ways that he participated in shaping the culture of the artistic avant-garde, particularly of the 1950s. If Williams's identity as a man of arts and letters is hard to categorize, he was not alone at Black Mountain. In describing the project of the school, Mary Emma Harris writes in The Arts at Black Mountain College, quote, "Throughout its history, Black Mountain was concerned with the nature and meaning of form in art, in institutions, and in lives, and with ways to keep those forms alive, vulnerable, and responsive." And I have a long quote that I want to give you. I'll read it, but it's also, you should see it because it's kind of long and kind of important. Ooh. Sorry. And this is from the founder of Black Mountain College, John Andrew Rice, this is the guy that started in 1933. And he writes, the way of education that I think, that I know is needed, is the way of the poet, the philosopher, scientist, artist. And the reason we have not adopted it before is that we have foolishly, ignorantly believed life was essentially competitive. And we have pushed the poet aside because he knows competition for the senseless, wasteful thing it is. As long as we cling to this old idea, we shall continue to look toward one another instead of looking toward a goal, toward something that we want to become. The measure of your success, as long as you compete with men, is the distance between you and them. You are forever looking forward to the leaders and back towards the followers, and they are always men, usually no better than yourself. The measure of your success, if you are a poet, a philosopher, artist, a creator, is the distance between you and the thing you want to create, between you and the person you want to become. During Williams's time at the school, John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg, among others, appeared at Black Mountain College for summer visits. Rauschenberg, who had been a student at the college just a few years before, famously blurred together the possibilities of painting and sculpture in his combines, like the goat thing I showed you called Monogram, assailing any delineation of rigid categories. Cage transformed music, incorporating not only silence and dissonance, but also the material properties of instruments and recording procedures and chance operations into his compositions. For artists and writers connected to Black Mountain, distinctions of form, genre, and mode all offered boundaries that were meant to be transgressed or dismantled in order to free the imagination. Perhaps the epitome of this conflation of the arts was the now famous performance in the summer of 1952 of John Cage's Theater Piece No. 1, an event that was the precursor to art happenings in the 1960s and 70s that included an improvisatory, spontaneous collusion of all the arts represented at Black Mountain: music, dance, painting, writing, and it was orchestrated primarily by Cage. Mary Emma Harris, who's really the preeminent scholar of Black Mountain, offers this description of this otherwise indescribable theater piece. So I'm quoting from her. A general summary of recollections places Cage on a ladder reading either his Meister Eckhart lines from it, a lecture on Zen Buddhism, the Bill of Rights, or the Declaration of Independence. M.C. Richards and Charles Olson, two teachers at the school, reading at different times from another ladder. Merce Cunningham dancing in and around the chairs. He was joined in his dance by a dog who, as an interloper, created his own time brackets. Rauschenberg either standing before his paintings or playing scratchy records of Edith Piaf, and others at double speed on an ancient wind-up phonograph with a horn loudspeaker. David Tudor playing a prepared piano and a small radio, and either Tim Lafarge or Nick Sonervich, possibly both, projecting movies and still pictures upside down on slanting surfaces at the end of the dining hall where the event was staged. So this is all going on at once. So it's, as you can see, just as you can imagine, just kind of a crazed event in which all these things are happening at the same time. If one tenet of Black Mountain held that an artist's obligation was to close the gap between art and life, then categories and distinctions between and among forms of artistic expression and production would be demarcations that needed to be dismantled. Since this ethos was the dominant condition of Williams's aesthetic education, the insufficient attention to Williams's photographs and his identity as a photographer means that there is a great deal more to discover in terms of thinking about Jonathan Williams and what his work signifies. Moreover, Williams has taken not only the most famous but the definitive portraits of Robert Creeley, Jack Spicer, and countless other writers and artists of the American avant-garde. The cultural and historical importance of these images means that Williams must be taken seriously as a photographer, and that his work constructs the human face and thus the mythology of a radical strain of American avant-gardism. It might be said that Williams himself contributed to the undervaluing of his talents or significance as an image maker. For instance, in the introduction to A Palpable Elysium, a volume collecting many of his famous color photographs, he asks that the professionals, that's what he calls them, regard him as, quote, a literary gent who takes the odd, tolerable picture. We might not take such self-deprecation seriously, however, because this demurral was a recurring rhetorical maneuver of Williams's. This gesture would unfortunately shape how people encountered the photography, regardless of the strength and composition of the various images. Portraitists often struggle against the fact that their subjects can overdetermine the reception of the image. In other words, viewers respond to the content, accepting it too often or too readily as something being a representation of how things are, the content overwhelming the form. So we think of this in terms of any author photograph that we see. We think, well, there's Stephen King or whoever, and we don't think about this as an art object that's shaping our reception of this person. We just think, that's who that is. We don't think of it as a kind of a sign. Like with this being Robert Creeley, you don't necessarily think of this as a work of art, as an artistic photograph. You think, there's Creeley, whoever that is. With Williams, this would mean that his photographs might be seen by some as simply or merely providing visual record of the artists and writers he supported, and the photographs are merely a means to that ends of promotion. Williams did, however, see himself as a writer first and foremost. What I am, he says, is a writer who has been very enthusiastic about photography ever since I studied a smidgen with Harry Callahan at Black Mountain College. This enthusiasm of Williams's is not to be underestimated, though his impressive photography collection includes work ranging from Frederick Summers to Ralph Eugene Meatyard to Gerard Malanga. All of these are famous photographers. Williams would also provide introductions and essays to published collections of work by many of these photographers, and his personal collections of contemporary photographs, now housed at the Beinecke, and his essays, while representing his taste, also illustrate that Williams remained a lifelong student of the art of photography. As is true with many artists, the attention to the work of others bore fruit in Williams's own art. So looking at other people's photographs starts to form his work. From Callahan and from Siskin, Williams learned, as he described it, the fundamentals of using the Rolleiflex camera that he owned, but he would become closer to Charles Olson and that poet's maximal enthusiasms for what language can accomplish. If in terms of skills, one cannot say Williams learned from his teachers more than the rudiments in terms of how to take a photograph, one can suggest that he learned about art itself and its possibilities as a way of life, a form of perceiving the world and participating directly in the shaping of that set of perceptions. Since the Black Mountain pedagogy emphasized experiential learning by doing, learning by discovering rather than through direct didacticism, Williams learned a form of attention that comes with the dedicated observance of details and particulars. John Rice, who was gone by the time Williams was there, emphasized the pedagogical difference in BMC's methods this way. He wrote, quote, "We're trying with increasing success to teach method as against content. Our emphasis is on process as against results. To us, the way of handling facts is more important than facts themselves." Aaron Siskin especially helped Williams to think of the connection of particularities to one's inner life. In commentary accompanying his portrait of Siskin, whom Williams described as one of his last mentors, Williams writes, quote, "Siskin and his abstract expressionist pals were among the first to show us that our innermost feelings can be found in the commonplace debris of the world, that they can be limned on walls and in stones and bits of stonework." Back to me, the world seen this way becomes a legible text of the self and the process of experiencing the world and responding emotionally to its intrinsic forms. In this sense, enthusiasm as a measure of the promise of one's own imaginative investments was a lesson that Williams discovered at Black Mountain College and would continue to shape his artistic ideals for decades to come. This might be the time to interrupt that Siskin in particular, who this image and this image, he made both of these images. He hung out with the abstract expressionists who you've probably heard of, like Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, others like that, of the mostly in the 50s in New York. But what happened, instead of dropping paint as they did, what Siskin did was go through the world and wanted to find to find real objects that, if you looked at them in detail, created these kind of abstract images, these abstract ideas of form. So here he doesn't want us to see necessarily, okay, this is maybe part of a fence or a grate or something. What he wants us to see is the form of this, and to think of it as form. Or this, obviously we can't read what that image is, but if you look at it, you start to see how this does kind of look like an abstract painting in those terms. Williams had not chosen simply anyone to become his mentors. Callahan and Siskin, both already fairly well known in the art world by 1951, would become arguably the two most important photographers of the mid-century. Siskin in particular came to be seen as the artist who brought abstract expressionist aesthetic impulses and ideals into the realm of photography, and his ability to create images of objects that would isolate formal qualities and abstract possibilities of concrete particulars. Coils of rope, the grain of unfinished wood, such as this, the loops of a snail shell, all offered Siskin a way of considering abstract form as a part of daily experience. In this way, Siskin's photography would endeavor to distill objects to some essential sense of their form as form itself. The lesson that Williams derived from Siskin is that for a good photographer, the world reflects back the possibilities of the self. Considering a photograph of Siskin included in Palpable Elysium, we can think about how this ideal manifests itself in Williams' thinking about portraits, as he tended to photograph people rather than objects. In Williams' portrait of his former teacher, and sorry, this is not a great scan, but you get a good idea of what the photograph looks like. Siskin's face is a quarter turned from the camera, his glance soft but direct in a way that suggests he's not looking at something specific. Clearly, Williams does not capture Siskin in the middle of some larger motion. In most of Williams' portraits, the figures have an almost palpable stillness. They are unhurried, indicating not only Williams' care as a photographer, but also something about what he was trying to express in his subjects. Moreover, the center of the image disappears almost completely into a shadow. Why is it that the center of the image in the portrait is so dark? The most clearly defined feature is Siskin's right eye, which is the furthest thing from the viewer. A photographer, it can be argued, captures one's own self in the act of seeing. Thus, attention as an end in and of itself, and attention to our various forms of engaged and engaging attention, was what Williams learned from Siskin and Callahan, as well as Charles Olson. Siskin's interest was objects, as the images I showed you earlier, but Williams finds similar possibilities of expression in living people. That is why Williams' portrait of Siskin is also, paradoxically, a representation of Williams' perception of his subject. So we're seeing not only Siskin, but how Williams sees Siskin, which is why Williams' portraits convey a kind of intimacy. Subjects reveal him, Williams, even as he reveals them to the viewer. To Williams' credit, the portraits are rarely so sentimental. Even though he loves Siskin, you don't see this as like a touchy-feely kind of thing, right? Indeed, in the Siskin portrait, the fact that the foreground is so dark suggests something about the fact that what is nearest to us is the most difficult to discern, and that one sees always with one eye in the light and one in the shadow. Guy Davenport said of Williams in his photography, quote, "The color slide, descendant of the magic lantern, is still the most charming disseminator of culture, and Jonathan Williams is its master. He is the iconographer of poets of our time and of the places and graves of poets gone to Elysium." Davenport's claims about Williams's photography indicate how a viewer might perceive the work in cultural and historical terms. If the portraits are iconographic, they create an authority by which to disseminate the importance and values represented by those figures in the photographs, values that might otherwise go unrecognized. Indeed, Williams specifically photographed his peers and those writers and artists, including Mina Loy and William Carlos Williams, who provided the contemporary foundations for a specific aesthetic genealogy. The photographs create a value for these authors, and that value then legitimates these figures who are often outside mainstream marketplace or institutional interests. Williams conveys authority to his subjects by means of the photographs, and this authority reinvests itself in his work. So what I'm saying is the fact of the photographs conveys a sense of authority to them, and these are the people that no one talked about in the 50s, and so by taking photographs and publishing them, what happens is that he establishes their authority. They're worth making books of and worth taking pictures of, and if you take the pictures seriously, then they will come across as serious people. So it's a way of really creating an authority for his friends, his peers, and the people that gave him license to be a poet or whoever. So it's like a big marketing thing. It's kind of like blogging. For an image to create its own authority, it must insist on itself. In Williams's portraits, we see a recurring formality in the poses and situations, which might convey veneration, and be why Davenport sees the images as iconographic. Rarely are the people in the photographs smiling or laughing or crying. This guy is definitely not smiling or laughing or crying. While the images have a form of intimacy, we never see the people in elaborated social context interacting with others. Very often they're like this sort of thing. This is one of the most famous photographs of Charles Olson. It's kind of the definitive one. And although it's intimate, it's very close. It's not, as I said, it's not sentimental. And also, he's not doing anything but posing. He's not in the middle of doing anything else. Perhaps because the only relationship being expressed is between the subject and the photographer taking the picture. So instead of seeing him working with somebody else, what we're seeing is it looks like he's looking at us, the viewer, but in reality, we can't ever forget that there's a photographer there. So anytime you have that kind of a photographic portrait, in actuality what's happening is the relationship between the photographer and the portrait taker. And in this case, in Williams's case, he knows all of them, so there's a kind of intimacy that comes along with this. But there's a tendency for the people in the photographs to be by themselves and to be either confronting the viewer or turned away from the gaze of the viewer. So this is Olson, who wrote the Maximus poems, wearing a suit and a serape, confronting the viewer. Creeley, and here is Siskin half turned, as I said before. That is to say, the people in the photographs that Williams takes, from Robert Duncan to Denise Levertov, are rarely engaged in an activity other than establishing a relationship with the photographer. And this is Robert Duncan, as we see, again, turned away. The formality call it a form of distance, may be what is so decidedly masculine about Williams's photographs, and is the means by which the images manifest their authority through their seriousness and their emotional coolness. And so let me interject here that Black Mountain was a very macho place. And really, even though that there were women that were there, it was a really macho place. It was a macho time, the 40s and 50s. And Olson in particular would, as the big guy, remember, Olson was the head of Black Mountain when he was there, and really had a big problem with women, and often would kind of scare them out of his class or not really let them talk, because he was so macho and had weird problems with women. And this was just kind of percolated all through Black Mountain. And so one of the arguments that I make is that if you look at the images from Black Mountain, they tend to be pretty masculine. So as I say, that there's an authority that comes through their seriousness and their emotional coolness. Cool may not be the most precise word, since it often implies something negatively marked, some negatively marked withholding of emotions. I mean it in the way that Miles Davis played cool jazz in the 1950s. In Williams's Forward to the Aperture Masters of Photography volume that collects Callahan's most famous images, he remarks on the stillness of these photographs. Harry's a quiet man. Where do you find any noise in his photographs? A little surf is all I can locate. He has a famous image, a couple famous images of the ocean and his wife in the ocean. And again, this is a Callahan piece, which I think you can see that stillness. Williams goes on to suggest that Callahan's photographs are best viewed while listening to Musica Calada by the Catalan composer Frederic Mompou. Mompou's music is impressionistic and built on careful, fragile melodies for solo piano, and he's been described as a successor to Claude Debussy. One can take Williams to be suggesting that Mompou's quiet, contemplative work for solo piano creates sympathetic conditions for viewing Callahan's images in such a contemplative mood. However, while Williams's portraits may not be as seemingly contemplative as Callahan's photographic meditations on his wife Eleanor's nude figure, such as this, for instance, Williams' images do find ways of capturing a stillness that marks the people he photographs. That seems still, as does this, as does this, as this. One telling difference between Williams's portraits and Callahan's is that the latter consciously intends an artfulness that a viewer would immediately recognize. If you look at the images from Callahan that I showed, they look like art photographs, whereas Williams's don't necessarily seem like they could be on the back of a book jacket or something. And so Williams, on the other hand, is much less evident in the artifice of his photographs. The subjects, though posed, are not elaborate tableaus. The people in his pictures are people first, subjects second. Yet to miss the artfulness altogether is to not look at Williams's images carefully enough. So again, I'm suggesting that they don't present themselves as art, and yet if we look at them as art, we see them differently. Important critics of photography, such as Roland Barthes and John Berger, have argued that the force of photographic images comes from the act of choice that conveys significance to whatever is photographed. In an initial period, writes Barthes in his seminal work, Camera Lucida, photography, in order to surprise, photographs the notable, but soon, by a familiar reversal, it decrees notable whatever it photographs. The camera names its own authority this way. One result of Williams's photographic authority was that he became perhaps the primary chronicler of Black Mountain in the 1950s, and his images developing into the foremost representations of the writers connected to Black Mountain. His portraits of Olson and Creeley and Duncan have become the most famous taken of these authors, and he would also go on to take the definitive photographs of Lorene Niedecker, Louis Zukovsky, and Jack Spicer. The interesting question is not that he took strong, recognizable photographs, but that Williams's camera served as a way of determining value for these writers. In many ways, the sheer formal seriousness of attention evinced by these photographs conveys some of that importance to those artists and authors being represented. That the figures are presented in powerful ways as serious subjects, the viewer is persuaded to see the people that way as well. The power of photography in terms of its ability to persuade is generally true, but Williams clearly was aware of how to make a photograph's rhetoric legitimate his avant-garde community. And I guess I'll hold on a second. In the Black Mountain images especially, which these two are and some of the ones I'm about to show, which are some of the earliest example of Williams's mature work, he comes to Black Mountain in 1951, and these are coming, as you see these dates, 1951. Williams's portraits represent not only a countercultural intensity, but a masculinist vision of the writers with whose company he kept. In Williams's most famous images, this form of physical power is often literally foregrounded. Olson's massive form, there on your left, shirtless, hunched over a writing table with a gourd at hand. Creeley as the dark-eyed Spanish assassin. That's this one. Or Creeley perched atop a broken toilet. The painter Dan Rice at his side, peeking out of a barrel. Joel Oppenheimer growling at the camera while Francine Duplessis stands with feet planted and arms defiantly akimbo. All of these images serve to represent a playful but fierce artistic temperament as the essential environment of Black Mountain College. At the same time, the emphasis on physicality, coupled with Williams's characteristic cool, make the image specifically masculine. Catherine Litz, I think, which the dancer is not as remarkable in terms of that masculinity, obviously, but actually I'd say I kind of make the case that Francine Duplessis is, she's jutting out, it's like, here's the phallus, that sort of thing, which she had to do in order to survive there. He said phallus. It would be worth considering in another context what the specific function of this masculinizing plays in Williams's production of photographic documents of Black Mountain that are utilized to introduce the personas of Black Mountain College into literary and artistic communities at large. So what does it mean that these are the images that he chooses in order to market or expose Black Mountain and its aesthetics to the world at large? This particularly gendered set of documents would indicate the influence of Olson even on Williams's photographic work. Although there were a number of gay or bisexual students at Black Mountain in the 1950s, including Jonathan himself was gay, Michael Ruemaker, John Wieners, and Franz Klein. Franz was bisexual. The environment was Cage was gay, Merce Cunningham was gay. The environment was, Rauschenberg was gay. The environment was... The environment was overwhelmingly hyper-masculinist. As Michael Davidson shows at length in Guides Like Us, citing masculinity in Cold War poetics, Olson's poetics and pedagogy were deeply masculinist, and given his sway and influence during his tenure as the school's rector, it makes sense that this ideology would assert itself on others. In Black Mountain, an exploration in community, Martin Duberman cites his interview with Jonathan Williams, in which Williams says categorically, quote, "It took me a long time to get out from under Olson," end quote, which I always took as a bit homoerotic, but Williams is, maybe it's just me, Williams is speaking, and Jonathan, very likely Jonathan. So Williams is speaking specifically about Olson's influence on his poetry, and yet for anyone connected to Black Mountain, art and life, aesthetics, and worldviews were continuous and interdependent. The patriarchal ethos would manifest itself in the photographic representations of these authors in almost unavoidable ways. Once outside of Olson's aura, Williams would take portraits that were not so strongly gendered as his Black Mountain pictures. But as I have indicated, they do maintain a coolness and a reserve that are in traditional terms coded as masculine. Even the color values of Williams's images are muted or keyed low. This is of Simon Cutts, the artist, writer, bookmaker. This is Sally Mann. If a photograph enacts the photographer's identity, becoming the screen by which to discover how he or she sees, then we are to see the images as being Williams's desired reality. That is, the photographs become allegories of his desire. Or was this a reflection of Williams's own complex visions of how to be both masculine and gay? These questions are not easily resolved, to be sure, and yet if Davenport is correct in his idea that Williams's photographs disseminate a form of culture, the questions of what and how the visual markers of identity are circulated become relevant in terms of the cultural work Williams's portraits, or any portraits for that matter, accomplish. Although different arts, there are certain commonalities that poetry and photography share, according to Williams. He writes, quote, "Poets and photographers do not necessarily believe in public audiences or constituencies. They believe in persons with affection for what they see and hear. They believe in that despised, uncontemporary emotion, tenderness." What if we were to take this idea of tenderness as a poetics of Williams's photographs? Immediately, there's a productive tension in that the images are not evidently tender. This doesn't, for instance, this one doesn't seem particularly tender. But he's saying that tenderness is part of it. So the question is, what is the idea of tenderness working in his photographs? And might it reveal an idea of attention as being both a tendency and a form of tenderness? So that I give my attention to anything at all becomes an act of both attention and tenderness. Again, this complicates the photographer's relationship to the people he photographs and makes the masculine vision far more nuanced. Williams's assertion indicates the simultaneity of the public and the private and suggests that the images are private, intimate perceptions that are made public. In that sense, the images resist being made into generalizations. It is the photographer's relationship to that person being photographed that is of paramount importance. But in looking at Williams's portraits, one engages not only what tenderness looks like, but how it sees. So this is tenderness in the act of seeing. This is a communicable tenderness, something like a binding empathy that forms the possibilities of community. So one sees, this is how tenderness sees the world. This is how tenderness sees, Jonathan Williams's tenderness sees Sally Mann. And then in looking at this, we learn how to look at other people with tenderness. With this relationship, we can see the enactment of what John Rice believes was one of the primary missions of Black Mountain College. Quote, "In general, the effort of Black Mountain College is to produce individuals rather than individualists, in the belief that the individualist is bound to be a misfit in modern life, while at the other extreme, the subordination of men and women to a uniform and consistent pattern of action will inevitably prevent the creation of a better society than we now have. The first step in the process is to make the student aware of himself and his capacities, in other words, quote, to know himself, end quote. Making these photographs, Williams determines his genealogy and reveals his process of looking. In turn, then, looking at these portraits, one stands in Williams's place, becoming the proxy for the relationship established within the photograph without ever losing one's sense of self. So again, this is the way of thinking of it. So when we're looking at the photograph, we're looking at Jonathan Williams looking at Sally Mann. Okay, so we're seeing through his set of emotions, through his tenderness. But because we're standing where he himself is standing, her relationship, because it's a two-way street, it's a dialogue, it's a dialectic, we are then standing, the relationship back, the thing coming back, the emotions coming back. Jonathan isn't there, we as the viewer are there, and we're taking his space. So we become the thing that the subject is now having a relationship, is no longer the photographer, but the viewer. So we take his place. And it acts upon us, and shapes us, and teaches us. There's a famous story about Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein in his response to someone who thought that Stein did not look like what Picasso had painted. "She will," he replied. What has always intrigued me about that exchange is whether Picasso meant that the portrait was ahead of Stein in the way that Stein believed the contemporary should be. Or did he mean that the image would become so famous that people would be unable to see Stein except through the lens of his painting? Artists, in a sense, create history before it happens. In numerous biographies, memoirs, and retrospectives of the avant-garde of the post-war period, Jonathan Williams's photographs serve as quintessential representations of the era as defined by the topography of artists' faces. His concept of the contemporary, also defined by what was outside established or institutional values, was made historical in part through the persuasive, inquisitive authority of his camera. Through his camera lens, he helped disseminate new aesthetic possibilities by the camera's ability to establish value through its gaze. The images that he created with his camera helped fashion an avant-garde community as a collective of individuals, each a face that enabled the work to be seen as human, as seeking to create the world as both subjective and objective at the same time, local and private, public and shared. Thanks. Because it was run by faculty. It was run by artists. It run by poets. And one of the problems was they really just didn't know how to run things that well. The other problem was because they weren't accredited, they never really they tried for a while to get money from the government with the GI Bill. That was why there was such an explosion of universities and colleges across the country after World War II, because there was money from the government to make this happen. They never really were able to get that money in a way that they could hold on to it. And the people that they were producing were also not, I mean, the students that were coming from there were artists and writers who weren't, I mean, these weren't people that were going into business and going into finance and things like that. And a lot of them were kind of outlaws or outliers, we say nowadays. And so, you know, they weren't necessarily coming from great families in the ways that other schools could have legacies in which, you know, all these famous or rich people went there, then the money pours in, or they produce people that go on to make a lot of money. A lot of times those alums will give back to the school. But Black Mountain, that didn't really occur. And, you know, the money that artists get now is not, I mean, it happened really in part starting, at least in America, with the abstract expressionists. So it wasn't for like 20 years later that the kind of people that they did produce were now like the most expensive artists really in the history of art. Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, I mean, both of them set records. But they weren't making that money until well after Black Mountain was closed. So it was an experiment, and so there was no way that it would probably have ever lasted. So when Olson was there, they were selling off the land little by little until the end, where they couldn't barely keep on the lights, and they had like one building that they could use. And most of them, you know, like I said, they were poets, and they wanted to be famous poets, not administrators.
I'm just thinking about what's at stake in an artist's photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I'm thinking about where we use artist photographs today. Like, you know, a novelist, there's usually an artist photograph on the back. Certainly a visual artist, there's usually a photograph of the artist at the back. Logan doesn't have a photograph of himself at the back of his critical book. I imagine you don't either. But there's a sense that artist photographs matter more than the philosopher's photograph.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if that goes back to that distinction that you were drawing earlier that Logan quoted about the philosopher's mode of thought being about abstraction and the poet or the artist mode of thought being about experience. And this notion that the artist is that experience that is the artist's locus of authority is sort of legible
Mm-hmm.
on his or her body. But the abstraction of the philosopher sort of is generated by this fiction that the philosopher is sort of disembodied, that kind of Cartesian cogito that is independent of its body. So
Mm-hmm.
the sense that the artist's image matters because it's that body, that experience is there. And by looking at the artist, there's this wish or fantasy or hope or suspicion that we can sort of learn more about the artist's experiences by looking at the sort of corporeal instrument that is experienced it. Whereas with the philosopher, there's not really that much at stake. Does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would put it is that, you know, for a lot of the philosophers, even the ones like, well, I mean, some are different. Like Nietzsche, you'll find, you know, that there are a lot of images of Nietzsche, representations of Nietzsche, because he's someone that insists on the self. But very often, I mean, you know, if you go back through philosophy, I mean, back to, you know, Socrates even, who differs from the self, that what they're trying to put is the emphasis on a rational system in which anyone can plug into that. So it has to be true for everyone. It can't just be true if I'm a philosopher. It has, my belief system then is imported out into the world. And so it has to be true for everyone. So it can't only be an expression of myself, because then it wouldn't obtain to everyone. Whereas the romantic image of the artist that we've inherited from Romanticism forward, that it is primarily self-expression, And so then to tie a face to that, as well as Whitman did. I mean, Whitman is pretty much the guy that really, of anyone, really figured it out. He was the most photographed author of the 19th century. And his first edition, 1855, makes clear, I mean, his name isn't even there. It's the image of him, and him with the hat cocked and the shirt unbuttoned. And that, alongside this Walt Whitman song of myself, this becomes the sort of, the image defines who he is, like that the self is that readable text, as you say. So I agree with you. It's slightly different in terms of the cultural factors that are informing those things.
There's also, I think, the sense that the artist's productions are more difficult to interpret than the philosophers, in the sense that the philosopher's business is explication and exploration, whereas the artist's business is different. And so the sense that the artist's space might give us clues. I'm thinking of these big debates in Shakespeare studies about which is the authentic portrait of Shakespeare.
Right.
A lot of it revolves around a kind of phrenological assumption that the bumps and the crannies and whatever give you some indication as to what kind of person this is, and as a result, some kind of interpretation in trying to untangle the meaning of his or her text.
Right.
And I guess also the idea that the artist's business is self-expression, and so the body functions as one more object. So
Oh, absolutely.
like Salvador Dali, where the body is a canvas.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing would be sort of not the case for the philosopher.
No, absolutely, yeah.
It's such a complex world there. That masculine environment that you describe so well ostensibly stand in conflict with the founding philosophy of the college, which was to eliminate competitiveness and do something with distance. But then you move into that sort of theme of tenderness or the exploration of that. But it's not simple to judge or describe this period in this time, I guess.
Yeah.
And the role of photography seems really important because it seems to, a lot of what they were doing or experimenting with was the sort of, not necessarily a collapse of distance, like say in music, where you don't have the performers up on stage and the audience sitting below, or something. You have them all sharing a space, right? And photography almost insists on a distance, right? That you can experiment with close-ups, right? And sort of try to eliminate or reduce that distance. But still, it's such an overdetermined medium because it's so ubiquitous in mid-20th century culture and so on.
And controlling and constrained at the same time. There's only one place to look with the photograph. Whereas the performance that you were talking about was notable for the fact that you couldn't focus on
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to throw out like a footnote. If you're, one book that I really recommend is Black Mountain Days by Michael Roommaker. It's a memoir. And Roommaker wrote a really famous short story called Trucks that he wrote when he was a student at Black Mountain. And it's pretty good, and he hasn't done a whole lot since. But he wrote a great memoir, like I said, called Black Mountain Days, which is really powerful in terms of Roommaker is gay, and he goes to Black Mountain to study with Olson, and I don't really know of a better sort of document talking about the complexities of being gay and being at Black Mountain, and like trying to figure out what it meant to be gay in the 50s at Black Mountain, which is in some sense, really forward and progressive and weird, and also at the same time not entirely, you couldn't entirely be open in terms of there were ways that you could be gay, like Jonathan's way, but there were ways that you couldn't be gay. And so Roommaker finds himself really caught in this trying to find out how to determine an identity for being gay in Black Mountain in the avant-garde community in the 1950s. It's really complicated and really fascinating and also really moving. So I really recommend, if you're at all interested in what it meant to be gay in that particular community.